Friends and neighbors, thank you for being here. I'd like to thank the staff of the Holley Williams House. Although the signs say Holley House, I've been informed it's called the Holley Williams House. I'm grateful to the staff of the Holley Williams House for keeping the house in such beautiful shape and keeping it so contemporaneous with the Emersonian spirit and the Emersonian environment in Concord, Massachusetts. And above all, I want to thank my two friends, Tom Shackman and Dick Boyle, for making this appearance possible, for inviting me here. I've discovered that if you have friends like Tom and Dick, you don't need Harry. You need Harriet, but you don't need Harry. Tom's given you a very good profile of the Who is here today. Let me add what the journalists always say are the basic essentials after who, and that is why, what, and how. The why is because I've been addicted to, if not obsessed, with reading Emerson for over 40 years. And my particular involvement with him, love affair would not be too strong a word, intensified in the late 50s when I was in the latter stages of converting from having been a soldier to being a pacifist. I had been in the war for 4 years, 2 years in the Pacific, and on August 6, 1945, when that bomb dropped, I knew that neither I nor the world could ever be the same again. And my particular choice was to try to find a way to live a nonviolent life. For me, that required a kind of re-education in many ways. I won't go into the behavioral details that I had to undergo in order to learn how not to hit people, but, and more important, how not to feel like hitting people. But in the background of all that was my reading. And my reading at that time was very much influenced by the people I was hanging out with who had been professional, if I may use the word, pacifists for a long time. People had gone all the way back to World War I as conscientious objectors and leaders of nonviolent lives. The minister A.J. Musty, among others. And they led me to a great deal of reading, which included, as an environmental background to my new nonviolent life, the obvious ones, the George Foxes, the Lao Tzus, the Buddhas, but also the ones closer to our era, including the man who had most influenced American letters in the last 100 years, Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's said that Ralph Waldo Emerson had the ideas, Thoreau nurtured them, and Whitman gave them to the world. That is underselling my mentor, Emerson, but that's certainly the lineage that I was introduced to and which became terribly important to me. And so what I did in effect is to make Emerson my teacher, whether you wanted to be or not. His prose, his poetry, his ideas, even his sermons, although he had defrocked himself as a minister, resonated with me in such a way that I decided that he was going to be my master. And by the 70s, I even had the arrogance to write a book called Choosing and Changing, with the subtitle, A Guide to Self-Reliance, in which I made the very bad mistake of trying to convert his brilliant philosophy to everyday self-help psychology. I've forgiven myself, I hope you'll join me. In any case, I made him my teacher in the way that he wants to find a teacher. He said, the teacher is not him who gives me the most facts, but him in whose presence I become a different person. And I felt myself under the spell of reading him as assiduously as I did and do. I felt myself changing. And I felt myself changing into a more authentic version of myself, not into the Hulk. I'm happy to say. In any case, I kept this up for all those years, and what happened was, now we're going to get to that's the why, now we're going to get to the what, and the what is this book, and how is how it came about. In early June of 2002, I was contemplating the pine and maple trees on our property when it suddenly occurred to me, as it does to all Americans, you know, this, as countries go, we're rather young, and we take our birthdays very seriously, and we take our dates and anniversaries very seriously, and I'm very much like that myself. And I went into Anne and said, do you realize that next May 25th is my man's 200th birthday? And she, who went to Concord Academy in Concord, Massachusetts, but was blessedly, absolutely free of his influence as far as I could see until I came along, said, well, you ought to do something about that. It reminded me, by the way, of an anecdote they tell about Emerson in his latter days. He did not have what we call Alzheimer's, but he clearly, in the last 10 years of his life, was suffering from a form of senile dementia, and he was having a great deal of memory loss. And sometimes he couldn't remember faces, and he couldn't remember names, and it's told of him that he went into his house where he had a beautiful portrait of Thomas Carlyle, his best friend in England. And he looked up, and he couldn't remember his name, but he just held out his hands and said, my man, my man. Oh. So, this is my man. This is my Carlyle. So, as I thought about his birthday, and was encouraged to think about his birthday, two thoughts came into my head. The first was the word almanac, because I had also recollected one of Emerson's very early entries in his own journals, in which he said, I propose to tell the truth in accurate reporting of what might be called a farmer's almanac of mental moods. He did that, by the way, for almost 60 years in his daily journal. And I thought, almanac, oh my, one of my favorite literary forms. And then the next thought came of a favorite book of mine from 1939 called An Almanac for Moderns. Dan Dwyer has a beautiful edition of it up in his shop. It's by Donald Culross Peattie, who was a naturalist not unlike our own local Hal Borland. Literate, civilized, sensitive, and brilliant as a writer. And Almanac for Moderns was published in 1939 with exquisite etchings by a great artist named Lynn Ward. So I put the two things together. I thought of almanac, Emerson okayed an almanac, and I had a model for an almanac. Culross Peattie had started his almanac on the vernal equinox, March 21st, gone through the whole year, and observed the changes of life, what Emerson would call the undulation and alternation of the seasons all through a year. And it's still a book well worth reading. So I commend you to look at it, and one of you at least to buy the one up at Dan's shop. I used to buy used copies of the trade edition at used book fairs and give them away to friends because I wanted to endorse it so much. But thus was the idea born. And it was confirmed by the fact that I knew that Emerson had written so much. His works comprise 50 volumes now, and they range from poems to essays to lectures to addresses to sermons to letters, 4,500 letters, over a long life. Born in 1803, died in 1882, and writing from the time he was 14. So I knew that there would be enough material in there, obviously, to have an entry for almost every day of the year, not always the same year, but that one could make an almost authentic almanac, and I hope that's what I've done. And that's what I'd like to share some of with you today. Before I do, I couldn't let it pass that you have been kind enough to give up a portion of a holiday weekend that to us Americans is very important, usually devoted to family, to leisure, to the outdoors, to enjoying nature, which Emerson would have approved of. But the 4th of July is certainly an important American holiday, and he, of course, had a great deal to do with it. Emerson's grandfather had been enlisted as a chaplain in the Revolutionary Army, and in fact died at Rutland of one of the fevers that infected American troops at that time. So he had very direct roots in the Revolutionary War, to say nothing of the fact that his beloved Concord is 10 minutes from the Lexington Bridge, as you all know. And so, in 1837, when the community had raised enough money to create a monument to the opening of the Revolutionary War that had culminated in today's event, that is this weekend's event, namely our independence, Emerson was moved to write his very famous Concord hymn. And I think it would not be inappropriate for us to be reminded of what he said in it. By the root bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their dead redeem, when our sires, like our sons, are gone. Spirit that made these heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare this shaft we raise to them and thee. That's the Concord hymn. Still said on the 4th of July in many places around this country 180 years later. And now what I propose to do is suggest and share with you the entries I've selected for this coming week. Why this coming week? Because Emerson told me to. On April 24th, I write in my commentary, Emerson always commits himself to the future, to the new, to the evolving. A saint, an angel, a chorus of saints, a myriad of Christs are alike worthless and forgotten by the forgotten by the soul, as the leaves that fall, or the fruit that is gathered in the Garden of Eden in the Golden Age. A new day, a new harvest, new duties, new men, new fields of thought, new powers call you. And an eye fastened on the past unsuns nature, bereaves me of hope, and ruins me with a squalid indigence which nothing but death can adequately symbolize. Let me go into that word unsuns, because many of you must have wondered what I was saying. It's U-N-S-U-N-S, like uncovers, unzips, undoes, unsuns, meaning takes the light out of. One of the usages of Emerson, not atypical, that makes him sometimes difficult to read. In my selections, I chose to let arcane expressions like that stay rather than edit my own teaching. So, because we do not want to unsun nature, because new thoughts, new fields call us, we're going to look at the passages from July 7th tomorrow to July 13th. And in addition to telling you what commentaries I've written on them out here, maybe we can talk a little bit about your reactions to them if you wish. So let's start with July 7th. My comments. Here, Emerson expands on Plato's concept of the universal soul and includes in it a psychic potential, that is psychological potential, that is immensely powerful but difficult to galvanize into action. The generic soul in each individual is a giant overcome with sleep, which locks up almost all his senses and only leaves him a little superficial animation. Once in an age, at hearing some deeper voice, he lifts his iron lids, and his eyes pierce through all appearances, and his tongue tells what shall be in the latest times. Then he is obeyed like a god, but quickly the lids fall and sleep returns. Related to an entry on February 21st out of the essay on self-reliance, which many of you will remember since it's one of the most famous phrases in all of Emersonian literature. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. And it is that flashing of those, what he later calls fugitive gleams, that he's referring to as being so difficult to reach in the depths of consciousness. July 8th. By the way, feel free to interrupt me. This is not a lecture. This, I hope, is what we would call a discussion. Emerson was able to lecture. I'm only able to discuss. July 8th, written a year before the previous entry. In this meditation on the exalted nature of being human, Emerson is showing in other ways the influence of Plato and the Vedanta texts. That's the ancient Hindu text, the most classic of which is the Bhagavad Gita, on his ideas about the qualities of the human spirit. A certain wandering light comes to me which I instantly perceive to be the cause of causes. It transcends all proving. It is itself the ground of being. And I see that it is not me, and that it is not one and I another, but this is the life of my life. That is one fact then, that in certain moments I have known that I existed directly from God, and am, as it were, his organ, and in my ultimate consciousness am he. The secondly, the contradictory fact is familiar, that I am a surprised spectator and learner of all my life. This is the habitual posture of the mind, beholding. But whenever the day dawns, the great day of truth on the soul, it comes with an awful invitation to me to accept it, to blend with its aurora. This is Emerson again talking about the need for all of us, in order to express our authenticity and uniqueness, to go as deeply into our consciousness, and later he'll talk about our unconscious as possible. On the 9th, this is in a lighter vein, but it's an aspect of Emerson that cannot be ignored. Emerson, the literary critic and tutor, could be blunt in his review of his friend's work, but he was faithful to his own principles and, quote, took time to be civil. This is to the poet Emma Lazarus, who had written to him on the occasion of the publication of his poetry the year before, and had therefore nominated him to become her tutor by mail, and had sent him manuscripts of things which she proposed to publish. This is the letter. Dear Miss Lazarus, I ought long ago to have taken a decided part, either to work out my criticism on your poems, as I doubted not at first to do, or to send them back, and committed them to your own criticism. But I still believe that my preoccupations were temporary, and the freedom would presently return, which does not return. I had fully intended to use your comment carried to Mr. Fields for the Atlantic magazine, the forerunner of the still extant Atlantic Monthly. But on reading it more carefully, I found what had so strongly impressed me on the first reading was the dignity and pathos of the story as you have told it, which still charms me. But the execution in details is not equal to the merit or to the need. You permit feeble lines and feeble words. Please now to articulate the word smileless, in quotes, which you have used twice at no long intervals. You must cut out all the lines at no long intervals. You must cut out all the lines and words you can spare and thus add force. I have kept the poem so long that you will have forgotten it much and will read it with fresh eyes. To all writers, cut down everything that does not delight you to the least possible. I have marked a few heedless words. Quote, doubt does not, quote, ravage nor be, quote, revenged. An introduction to the aspect of Emerson that is often deplored, namely his lack of humor. His humor tended toward the ironic, as you can see. He was not a Baffo storyteller, nor did he necessarily relish Baffo stories. But when we came, which we will not today, but when we would come, for example, to his reading of Whitman, who had a kind of buffalo quality, if I may say so, much of his writing, you'll see that Emerson resonated to it immensely. And even though he implored Whitman to change some of the raunchier references in Leaves of Grass, which Whitman naturally refused to do, Emerson never brought the subject up again. And the only other time that he was guilty of that prudishness was when he forwarded the manuscript to his friend Carlyle in England, and fearful that Carlyle would have his very prudish reaction, said, "Of course, if you want to consign it to a garbage pan, that's a garbage pail, that's your right." And that's exactly what Carlyle did, by the way, who had as blind an eye as many people to the importance of Whitman's poetry. Now, on July 10th, this coming week, is a poem called Lines to Ellen. And I won't tell you more about it until after I read it to you. Tell me, maiden, dost thou use thyself through nature to diffuse? All the angles of the coast were tenanted by thy sweet ghost. Bore thy colors every flower, thine each leaf and berry bore. All wore thy badges and thy favors, in their scent or in their savors. Every moth with painted wing, every bird is caroling. The wood boughs with thy manners waved, the rocks uphold thy name engraved. The sod throbbed friendly to my feet, and the sweet air with thee was sweet. There's a love poem, a little soupy. He was very soupy about her. At the age of 25, he met a 17-year-old woman, not from Concord, Massachusetts, but from Concord, New Hampshire. A tall, graceful, gentle, gifted, and what we would call feisty young woman, who herself aspired very much to be a poet. Her name was Ellen Tucker, and Emerson fell head over heels, and she likewise. And their exchanges during the time when they were calling Ellie Belly and Grandpa. You see, we're not the only fools around. The 19th century had its share. The correspondence between them was filled with this kind of rapture, somewhat ecstatic and ornate love poetry. And it seemed to foreshadow something that both of them knew, because each of them carried within them genetically the seeds of the dread tuberculosis which killed 3 of his brothers, and which she already was showing signs of when he wrote these lines to her. They married 2 years later, when he was 27 and she was 19, and their marriage lasted barely 2 years before she died. He was so overcome by it that he even went so far, which many biographers have taken the pains to point out was not so unusual in that era. 3 weeks after her death, went to the grave and opened the casket to reassure himself that she really was gone. He carried that love with him all his life. At one point, he says in another poem, there is one life, one baptism, one first love. And his second wife, a much sterner, much more different, and very difficult, we would say neurotic woman, whose name was Lydia Jackson. But like me, Emerson was given to giving people nicknames. He couldn't have it just Lydia, he had to make her Lydian. And, but she knew of his undying love for Ellen, and their second daughter, who remained unmarried and became Emerson's great companion in his later years, was named Ellen Emerson, with Lydian's complete understanding and approval, obviously, because she was her own daughter, and a great woman she was. So it was a tragic love affair, but one that, in one ironic way, had a great deal to do with our accessibility to Emerson, because what freed him to continue his literary work, which, as Tom pointed out correctly, was serving as the George Washington of American literature, giving a new voice, a new American voice to the world of letters, while paying respects to our European roots. What made that possible was his inheritance from Ellen. Ellen Tucker had come from a fairly well-to-do business family in Concord, New Hampshire, and as her widower, he had enough of a stipend to give him a certain amount of security for the next few years. And later, when his first daughter, Edith, had the wit to marry a very smart New Englander named Forbes, the elder Forbes took over the Emerson fortunes and made sure that it was never wasted again. So Emerson remained completely solid until the day he died. The house burned down. been conquered when he was about 68. He took a trip to Europe to try to recover from the pain of it. When he came back, the community had raised the money to rebuild the part of the house that had burned. It's still there. I'll talk about it a little bit at the end if I may. And he was very fond of it. Now we come to the 11th. In this particular journal entry, we must not read Emerson as being concerned with a person's, quote, public reputation, but rather use the words, see the words anybody as, quote, his own man. You'll know what I mean by that commentary when you hear the following. Society is babyish. Talleyrand's question is the main one to be asked. Not is he honest, is he rich, is he committed, is he of the movement or is he of the establishment, but, quote, is he anybody, unquote. We want fire, a little less mutton, and a little more genius. Now what do all those words mean? What they mean, is he anybody, means is he his own man? Has he gotten in touch with the fugitive gleams that lie deep in his soul and consciousness that make him uniquely who he is, and does he bespeak it? That's what he means by is he anybody. So that when he uses the word genius, he's not talking about talent, as we now call inordinate talent, quote, genius. He's talking about uniqueness. Genius is your psychic and creative thumbprint in Emerson's lingo. But notice the reference to, is he of the movement or of the establishment? That confirms something I found in another Emerson entry in Life and Letters in New England, where he actually can be given credit for coining the word movement and establishment. In every society, there are two movements, one running underground called the anti-establishment, wrote he in 1837. But on the other hand, he also coined the phrase, do your own thing. Because he says in one entry, if you go to church like other people, if you set your table like other people, if you eat like other people, I hardly know you. Do your thing, and I shall know you, he said. He's the high priest of Aquarius, right?